Greetings to everyone, wherever you are. I'm Bob McConnell, co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, and today our excellent panel will be discussing Mar-a-Lago 2 days and counting. Our panelists, all members of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation's Friends of Ukraine network, and if you're familiar with our work, you should be familiar with every one of them. I will make quick introductions in alphabetical order. General Phil Breedlove, retired Air Force, former Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. Debra Cagan is not on the screen, and she may or may not join us. Hopefully, she'll be able to get away from where she is and join. Whether she's here or not, Debra is a former official at both the State Department and the Defense Department. The titles Debra held, if listed, would never adequately explain her role in so many critical national security situations over the years. Ambassador Dan Fried, former Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Ambassador John Herbst, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, head of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, and the chair of the Friends of Ukraine Network's National Security Task Force. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, retired U.S. Army, former Commander, U.S. Army Europe, is a senior advisor to Human Rights First and also serves as NATO senior mentor for logistics. That's our team for today, and we will look at the latest meeting between Ukraine's President Zelensky and President Trump 2 days after they met in Florida. With no promise that I can do this for sure, there is a tab at the bottom of the screen where you can put in questions, and I will try and get to them if I can. It seems to me that Washington administrations of both parties have never really evolved beyond their Soviet mindset. The Kremlin seems to have hypnotized our executive branch. Yes, it's more complicated than that, but just a few superficial observations. When the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, the landscape of nations across the world changed. 15 independent countries came into being where there had been one Soviet Union. But our administration stayed focused totally on the Kremlin. Yes, there were reasons, nuclear weapons, size, and so forth. But we agreed to Russia taking ownership of every property in the United States that had been owned by the Soviet Union. We invited Boris Yeltsin for a state visit. President Kravchuk of Ukraine was invited to a working visit, thus proclaiming a diplomatic pecking order that has continued. Even after Russia violated virtually every international agreement and invaded Ukraine in 2014 and began its ongoing war with genocidal abduction of Ukrainian children, torture of innocents in the occupied territories, systematic rapes of women, savage targeting of hospitals, schools, playgrounds, and apartment houses, and the killing and torture of POWs, President Putin got a red carpet greeting in Alaska, while no officials from the United States met President Zelensky's plane in Florida. To me, all that seems as a canvas upon which the United States has and is continuing to mishandle its own vital national security interests in Eastern Europe. But that may just be me. Let's move on to the experts. I will follow the order of introductions for the opening, except, as is my usual case, I will ask Ambassador Herbst to bat cleanup before opening the discussions. Phil, you're a keen observer of the war and all the various meetings that have been taking place since Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014. Are these so-called negotiations getting us anywhere?
Well, as I've said more than once on these programs, I'm awed to be here with some of my most respected and best friends. And as I always say, they will clean up my messes as their discussions move forward. I want to just point out that what I'm about to offer is my opinion, and it will be delivered in the style of a fighter pilot debrief. I apologize occasionally for the bluntness. I do believe that our administration, in its own way, is trying to effect some sort of an agreement. But I think that, to be very frank, we have sent the wrong team. We have a businessman and we have a real estate agent that are there dealing with a tried and true KGB agent or KGB man. And I think that in that vein, we are being played in many ways to try to advance Russia's goals for this 12-year long war, and to keep things moving in the direction that they want to move. I have said on almost every one of these programs, that I want to repeat, it is my opinion that Mr. Putin never was a partner in peace for any actions in Ukraine. I do not believe Mr. Putin now is a partner for peace in Ukraine, and I do not believe that Mr. Putin ever will be a partner for peace in Ukraine. He wants to subjugate the people of Ukraine and use the country to benefit himself and Russia. I think that Mr. Putin finds himself in trouble now. His army is really struggling and he's having a hard time now keeping the right kind of force in the fields. And a year ago we said that he can never keep up these kinds of losses. And the losses have only accelerated, and he keeps throwing untrained, incapable troops into nearly impossible situations, and their losses and injuries are staggering. His economy is beginning to show the fissures of the ability to maintain government services to his own people in the face of the costs of this war. And I think what is really clear is that Mr. Putin is, as I said again, in trouble. And so what does he do every time he's in trouble? He begins to fashion a U.S. bailout in some way, shape, or form. I think the most recent is this week, and that is the false flag attack that he is using to try to make himself the victim. And by playing the victim, getting the U.S. Administration to come down on Ukraine. And that's exactly what we've seen. Even though Russian millboggers and Russian media themselves are pointing out that this is a false flag or a not a real attack, Mr. Putin continues to press on it. And sadly, our administration has accepted that as truth and even made remarks about why it's good they didn't give long-range weapons to Mr. Zelensky, because that would further facilitate these kinds of attacks. So Mr. Putin, once again, has set up to get American help when he's in the most trouble in trying to hold off and continue to get into a position to try to force his will on the Ukrainian people. I think, to close, as we talk about these negotiations, it is incredibly important that our nation understands who we're dealing with. We say about our proud American Marines, once a Marine, always a Marine. Well, I would offer that once a KGB agent, always a KGB agent. We're dealing with one. He is a war criminal, self-avowed. He gave an award to the minister of the department that is in charge of ripping Ukrainian children out of their homes and sending them back to Russia. He gave her an award. And then finally, I would say that Mr. Putin, as we have said before, is not interested in peace. And if we recognize those three values as we go forward and accept who we're really dealing with, we might find a better way to peace. Thanks, Bob, for letting me run my mouth.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Phil. Debra, I'm glad to see you were able to get here. Among other things, you regularly are in touch with officials throughout the world, Washington, Europe, and beyond. What are you hearing since the presidents met in Florida? And
Well,
anything else you want to say?
well, not much I can share, but I will say this, that there's going to be a meeting, of course, in Paris next week um, of coalition partners with the Ukrainians. I think that's a really critical meeting, and I think the Europeans, for all the insults and nastiness that's been going on, have really been hanging tough here. And I think that they are largely responsible for Trump having to walk back his inclination of pleasing Putin. I think a lot of the Americans around Trump were surprised that the Europeans were this tough. Um, I think it's been a while in coming, but I'm pretty impressed with how firm they've been in their position and how strong they are on this. And I think although there's probably at the White House referring to the French, the Germans, and the Brits as the unholy triumvirate, I think it's quite a holy triumvirate at this point. So I think a lot will be discussed next week in Paris. There's also supposed to be a follow-on meeting in Washington of the senior leaders, along with Zelensky and Trump, maybe later this month. Um, but I think it's interesting that, as General Breedlove said, I would really like to have been a fly on the wall in those 4 hours of telephone conversations with Vlad, the impaler, as I call him, and to hear what was really said there. I think it was probably a lot of toadying and obsequiousness, something that's just not in my DNA, but there you go. Um, the I think the issue on security guarantees is a really critical one. I think there's some specifics and some not so specifics. I think there were a lot of commitments and promises made, but until something is physically in writing and what's the drop points here? At which point does the U.S. get involved? What's the tripwire for the Europeans? If the Russians start shooting at the Europeans, is the U.S. going to come in and help the Europeans, or is it going to sit on its hands and say you're on your own? Similarly, for Ukraine, the answer, the security guarantee cannot be, well, you can just shoot back because that's what they're doing now. So I think more details on the security guarantees. They're correctly keeping these very close hold, what they are. But I think they would have to involve a number of things that the U.S. would have to commit to. And I don't think it means just for deploying a bunch of aircraft in Poland. I don't think that's just the right answer. And I think a lot else has to happen here. And I think that will be part of the discussion with the Europeans next week about what's their break point as well. Where do they expect the U.S. to come in and be of assistance? I think that the talks were generally described to me as being positive. Um, and I think kudos to Zelensky for being above the fray of the silliness that went on in the margins. And I think that was very positive. I think that there's much more work to be done. I don't think there's any settlement on the Western Donbass as Sekur has, I think, correctly described as the superhighway to Kyiv in a matter of, what has it been, 3 days? You know? And I think there hasn't been a lot of settlement on that. And I think that there's still not figured out. I don't like to use the word DMZ. I prefer to call it a temporary zone of separation because I think a DMZ has too many, Korea analogies that don't stand up well. But we'll see if what that means. And we'll see if the Russians would ever agree to really pull their forces out of the rest of that region and fall back. I don't know that that's the case. But I think I think the view is as long as the Russians think that they can play Trump on this, they're going to continue to do that. And one other comment on General Breedlove about the number of Russians who are being killed. I mean, the Russians are doing what it's 250th anniversary here, so I'll say kind of like King George used the Hessians at Newark, and we saw what happened to them at Newark. But I think that the Russians are using, they've been recruiting in South Africa. They've been recruiting elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa for soldiers of fortune here. Other than using Koreans, there's other people from the Middle East who have been captured. And so there's just quite the bevy of people that they've been offering money to go get killed on Russia's behalf. So I think this thing that they're just going to run out of, assets, they'll just keep paying people to do what they're doing. So I think Trump's perspective is that Russia will eventually get everything, so you might as well give them a chunk of it now, is not the right perspective. But I think he's being fed that by a number of people who still believe that there's a moral equivalency between Putin and Zelensky.
A lot to think about, Deborah. Thank you. Dan, you always have insights into diplomatic dealings. You wrote an article in the Kiev Post suggesting Zelensky make Putin the problem at the meetings. Trump might have made that difficult for Zelensky by opening the meeting by saying, I just talked to Putin. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are that the deal being worked out between the US and Ukraine with European input could work. Now, Deborah's right. It's not clear where the ceasefire line will be, and the details of the security arrangements for Ukraine haven't been finalized. But within what I understand of the four corners of the 20-point plan, it could work. The greatest single piece of evidence that the discussions in Florida were productive is that Russia the next day tried to derail the process with this bogus charge of a Ukrainian attack on one of Putin's palaces. The Ukrainians have handled the negotiations skillfully, so have the Europeans. And I think although the US negotiating team has its weaknesses, I think that the 20-point plan, by most accounts, was zeroing in on something that might have been practical. Putin is trying to overturn this. The Russians have given nothing in the negotiations, and now they have officially announced that they're going to harden their position. I don't know what that means, since their position has been maximalist all along. The fact is, and I think General Breedlove and Debra both made this point, and I agree with it, but I'm going to say it again. The Russians have no interest in a fair or durable negotiated settlement of the war. Putin certainly doesn't. He seeks to subjugate Ukraine. But Putin may be sensitive to a changing correlation of forces. What frustrates me about the US position on Ukraine is that we have perfectly good leverage on the table, which we can use practically. And if we use it, we may find that the Russians are more amenable to, they may be in a more agreeable frame of mind to negotiate something. We have plenty of headroom for sanctions, plenty of things we can do to weaken the Russian economy. There are plenty of things we could do to provide a steady flow of weapons to Ukraine. The US could be more forthcoming in its willingness to back up the European coalition of the willing, and I hope that we make this offer. If we do everything that's within our power to do, Putin may adjust his position, not because he wants to, but because in good Stalinist fashion, he will respect the balance of power. And we have unused leverage, which we're not using. But right now, Putin has managed to grab the initiative with these, frankly, bogus charges for which there has been no evidence of a Ukrainian attack on one of Putin's palaces. And he's using that to undermine the momentum that seemed to be developing. So this is very much in motion. Unless and until the Trump administration decides to lean on Putin, nothing will happen. This is going to require a Trump stare down of Putin. And Trump has the ability to do this. There are many people who are skeptical, don't think Trump will ever do it, either because he's on Putin's side or because he's susceptible to Putin's flattery. I don't know what the answer is. But I do know that if Trump wants to be vindicated, and if he wants to emerge from this as a winner, he's going to have to stare down Putin. And again, and I'll end here, what frustrates me enormously is that we have the ability to put greater pressure on Russia, and we're not yet using it. I hope we do.
Thanks, Dan. Ben, you're there in Frankfurt. You are constantly traveling through Europe, speaking with leaders and assessing the evolving climate. Please, your thoughts on what's been said and what you are hearing in Europe.
Well, first of all, I think that European leaders are no longer fooled by President Trump's his attitude. The national security strategy that was recently put out was a punch in the stomach for many of them, but now, the scales are falling from their eyes. I don't think there's anybody out there that's secretly hoping that President Trump really will, revert to traditional American policies towards Europe. They see that. They also see that the Trump administration's approach to this whole negotiation is a disaster. It was doomed from the start. And as much as I wish that my friend Ambassador Fried was correct, there is no way in our lifetime that President Trump is going to do what's required. Dan's right. Trump has enormous leverage, so many things, but he has not even enforced any of the sanctions. He has turned away at every possibility where to even say that Russia is the aggressor. So I think the Europeans realize that they're going to get stuck with this. They should have realized this a long time ago, but nonetheless, I think they've come to the realization that the Trump administration's approach to these negotiations was doomed from the start because it never acknowledged that Russia was the aggressor. Not once have they told Putin to get your troops out of Ukraine. He hasn't used any of the sanctions, and all the pressure has been put on Zelensky. And I think you can watch and see the real, genuine support that most European leaders have for the Ukrainians, specifically for Zelensky, who most people see now as the leader of the free world, compared to how they view President Trump. And so I think the combination of failure to act decisively in a leadership role by the President of the United States, Trump's alignment with Putin was never clearer than it was the other day at Mar-a-Lago. The things he said, how he talked about his phone calls with Putin, and how he sided with the Russians on almost every aspect of that long, dreadful press conference. The Europeans see all that, and then of course the aforementioned national security strategy. So they have no trust in the administration. By the way, they absolutely do not trust. That's why every time I'm with anybody, people are asking, first of all, what the hell is going on in the United States? And, here in Germany, the favorite sport is not soccer, it's criticizing American policy. It was always that way. But they always respected America and our system. That is gone. Like Ivo Dauter said in his Substack yesterday, 75 years gone. Now, fortunately, certain European leaders are finally doing what they should be doing. People like Friedrich Merz of Germany, Donald Tusk in Poland, Alexander Stubb from Finland. I want to say Prime Minister Starmer of the UK, but he's in such a sad, weak domestic political situation that I think his throw weight is fairly light. And then Dr. von der Leyen from the European Commission, she is involved deep in all of these things. The fact that the Europeans could not force Belgium to unlock all of the frozen Russian assets, that's a failure, although it was enabled by not only Russian pressure, but also pressure from Washington, D.C. So the Europeans found another way to come up with at least 90 billion euro that they can provide to help Ukraine. So they are looking for solutions because they know that they are going to be left with the cleanup. When this is all done, They know that the United States is not going to be there. The United States is not going to have a meaningful role in any sort of a security guarantee. And so if Ukraine fails, in the context of all that I just said, it will be because Europe failed. And they know that means millions more Ukrainian refugees coming into Central and Western Europe, continued disruption of energy and food, and the potential of the Red Army showing up in Moldova or even in a Baltic country. Finally, the idea of a security guarantee. I think the best model that we could look at would be the I-4, the NATO implementation force that went into Bosnia to implement the Dayton Peace Accord, where you had a zone of separation and you had combat troops with air power, tanks, artillery, everything in numbers big enough to deter the Serbs or the Croatians or the Bosnians from violating that. But that was because they went in there with a clear mission and a very clear rules of engagement. They were allowed to shoot back immediately. So any force that's part of a security guarantee that doesn't have all of those things is a total waste of time. The Russians will test it in the first hour, and the first time they launch a drone over or near a peacekeeping or a security guarantee force, and we don't shoot back, then the whole thing is shot. It's done. So the Russians know that, and I think the Europeans know that, and so they are trying to decide, can they put together a security guarantee type force that should go between Russians and Ukrainians, not sitting in Poland or Western Ukraine, which will be worthless. But also, what else can they do to help guarantee Ukraine's security? And I think really guarantee is not a good word, because it's impossible to guarantee that nobody will ever attack you. But I think making Ukraine indigestible, making Ukraine like Finland, making Ukraine like Israel, where its industry and its population are determined to deter Russia from a future attack. So this is where I think Europeans are looking to find a way to do that. Last point I'd make is Ukraine, I think, has figured out their theory of victory, and it is the destruction of Russia's oil and gas infrastructure. And interestingly, no European leaders have come out and criticized this. You've got Ukrainians destroying terminals, refineries, and even going after some of the Shadow Fleet vessels without criticism from European capitals. I thought that was important. And so if the Europeans themselves would figure out a way to stop the Shadow Fleet vessels that are going out to the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea that they could live with, that would really be a hammer. Over.
Well, thanks, Ben. You gave us a lot there. John, you're the cleanup hitter again. Take it away.
First, let me point out something our audience has already, I think, figured out, that the panel, while we all agree on what's important for the United States, that making sure Putin does not take political control of Ukraine, disagrees regarding where the Trump administration is going. And that there's plenty of reason for that. In fact, my view is closer to Dan than to Ben's. But Ben's view is, I would say, the majority view in the analytical community, that Trump is not going to push hard against Putin's aggression in Ukraine, and he'd be willing to see a Russian win in Ukraine. I ultimately agree with Dan, because I think that Trump does not want to be known to history as Putin's patsy, which he would most certainly be if he would allow that to happen. But there is evidence for the other point of view. So let me just talk about the latest kerfuffle, or rather how we got to the latest kerfuffle. The negotiation that began when Putin dispatched Dmitriev to Florida to see Witkoff came the day after Trump put serious sanctions on Russia, on Lukoil and Rosneft, the two major oil companies in Russia. That was a big and positive deal. And Putin realized that his own calls to Trump were not as effective as they used to be. So he needed another route. and the route was Dmitriev to Witkoff. That led to the dreadful American plan for achieving peace, the 28 points, which Secretary of the Army Driscoll delivered to Zelensky in Kiev in the middle of November. And I call it dreadful because it included at least 3 points that were overwhelmingly favorable to the Kremlin. One, handing over highly fortified Western Ukraine, which the Russian army has been unable to conquer, to the Russians. Two, limiting the armed forces of the victim nation, not the aggressor nation. And three, my personal favorite, because I love irony, was the treatment of the Russian frozen state assets. Ukraine would get 100 billion of the roughly 300 billion, and Russia and the US would divide up the remainder. In other words, the large majority. A cosmic joke if I ever saw one. Fortunately, after some criticism, including from Republicans in the Senate, a negotiation was held a few days later in Geneva. Rubio led those talks for the United States, and we got the 20-point plan, which was infinitely better. Let's put it this way, not infinitely better, much better. It got rid of those dreadful points that I've referred to, plus some others. The Russians, of course, objected, and we began another round of talks. And my assessment of the talks in Florida between Trump and Zelensky were largely positive, except for the president's remarks after the fact regarding the clear Russian active measure of the alleged Ukrainian attack on Putin's residence. What was achieved in Florida, while not wonderful, was good enough for government work. Zelensky offered a significant concession, potentially dangerous, of being willing to move Ukrainian forces back from their positions in fortified Western Donbass, provided Russian forces moved at least an equal distance from the line of contact, and provided that he got security guarantees, and provided that European forces, not feckless UN forces, were placed in between the Russians and the Ukrainian military. Interestingly, Trump gave something serious back, although what it is, we still need to see the details, and that was 15-year security guarantees to be, if you listen to administration officials on background, ratified or approved by the Senate, a Senate vote. Now, this does not mean that those guarantees are rock solid, but remember, the blow-up in the Oval Office in late February came because Zelensky, perhaps too insistently, repeated two truths. You can't trust Putin, he's a liar, and Ukraine needs security guarantees. And that's what led to the blow-up. So Team Trump moved substantially in the right direction. Now, of course, this was partly overshadowed, and that's why I referred to the latest kerfuffle, when the Russians demonstrated. I was expecting the Russians to come up with some way to not say yes to this proposal coming from the United States and Ukraine without annoying Putin. And they settled on the phony talk about an attack on Putin's residence. As soon as I saw that, I said, oh, so that's their ploy. The sad thing, of course, was the fact that in initially talking about it in public, Trump appeared to kind of accept it. I say kind of accept it because the language was a little bit fuzzy, but any sensible analysis as he came down kind of on the side, yeah, this may have happened, or this did happen. Now, apparently he was challenged on this by News Nation or by some reporter after that, and said something like, well, you're claiming that's an allegation. We said, maybe you're claiming that's not a true story. Well, maybe you're right. So that's what I would call a half walk back of a dreadful comment. So at the end of the day, we have seen a round of diplomacy which started out in a truly dreadful fashion, which quickly became better. Another round of diplomacy which produced a document which seems to be okay, but again, we're not seeing this. We we get stuff reported in the press. And I imagine most of the listeners know that Axio is worth reading because someone with Worcester in the White House talks to them. But therefore, Axios provides basically the line coming from that person in the White House. And from there, we're getting some information about this. And so all of us have some contacts. We pick up bits and pieces from people on the inside. So we don't know precisely what's in play, but what's in play does not seem to be disastrous, although it is not exactly wonderful. Final comment. Watching the merry-go-round since Trump returned to the Oval Office, we see periods of movement in the right direction, periods of movement in the wrong direction. Things are never as bad as they seem when Trump is moving in the wrong direction, and never as good as they seem when they're moving in the right direction.
Okay. All right. One of the things in our question panel brings up something I think we probably all saw this morning. Does anybody know more about it? And that is that Ukraine, Pravda reported that Polish Prime Minister said U.S. troops would go into the buffer zone. Anybody know anything more than what was briefly stated in that quotes to say? Anybody?
I don't have an answer for that, but I'd really like to just make a point about the quote unquote buffer zone that's being discussed. And I think it's been discussed by several of us before, and that is, Russia has smashed its army in the last 4 years of this 12-year-long war. Russia has smashed its army up against a defensive wall in eastern Ukraine that has cost them hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And what we do not want, we all know that Russia will go back into Ukraine in the future. This will, even if there's a negotiated end now, it's just Russia finding time to rebuild its military. But the fact of the matter is, if we in this settlement give Russia open run at that by having it be a part of a demilitarized zone, then shame on us in the future for what Russia will do in its next attack. I think that any buffer zone being discussed now, in a manner of fairness to both sides, should be placed somewhere around the current line, and then part of the demilitarized zone is on Russia's side of the current line, and part of it is on Ukraine's line. And thereby, most of Ukraine's defensive belt would not be eliminated. We cannot allow any peace overture to set up Russia better to be able to attack next across a line that Ukraine has fought hard to hold.
If I could add to that, I agree with Phil's comment. I endorse it highly. My understanding, which again, this is all a little bit cloudy, so it could be wrong, is that the Zelensky proposal is that the demilitarized zone does move into Russian territory. So Russia would be retreating from the current line under Zelensky's idea, which seems to be what's in play, of the same distance that Ukrainian forces would move from its part of the line. And all of that would be demilitarized. Now, of course, Ushakov dismissed this concept, or rather qualified this concept 2 weeks ago when he said, well, all right, maybe our military would move, but our National Guard, which is a highly militarized paramilitary organization, and our police would be there. So that's completely a non-starter.
You mean the same guys who are in Transnistria? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's another point here, too. If the United States is going to give a security guarantee, and if these reports of U.S. troops being involved, that's particularly true, we are making ourselves, our own forces, more vulnerable if the Russians were to move, and we are giving that guarantee. Because have allowed the Russians to quickly take control of the fortified belt. So in terms of, I'm not a military guy, but Phil, you were, Ben, you were, and this would add to the vulnerability, even of our Air Force, if the Russians were operating from that fortified belt.
Yeah.
So any guarantee that doesn't have troops that are an effective deterrent against Russia is worthless. I mean, it has to be of a number with capabilities that could inflict real consequences on the Russians each and every fucking time that the Russians violated whatever the agreement is. Excuse me. I was looking at Phil's cup behind him and it slipped out. But that's the reality of who we're dealing with, and the Ukrainians know this. I mean, they went through Minsk one and Minsk two, and all the other stuff. And everybody on this call that's either participating or listening remembers Budapest Memorandum and another guarantee that didn't work out. So Ukrainians, I think, are very wise to be skeptical that we would ever do this. And I think this was President Zelensky calling Trump's bluff by saying, "Okay, we'll do it if you guarantee it for 15 or 30 or 40 years, however many years it is." And it has to be real capability like NATO's I-4 that went into Bosnia with rules of engagement that allow immediate, where Captain Freed doesn't have to call back to Washington or Brussels to ask permission, but immediately returns fire. Otherwise, it's an absolute, this will be a war college tabletop exercise, not a meaningful deterrent to Russia's resuming the conflict.
And Ben, I would never grade your paper, but I would add a one thing. There has to be American flags involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about air power?
Well, I did say air power on the first go round. That's I will say this not because Phil's on the call, but because every Army soldier doesn't even want to think about life without world's greatest Air Force. And we don't. I mean, we don't. It's basically it's implied.
Yeah. Deborah, one other thing, I guess it wasn't with us, but it was another webinar or a speech. I mean, you really laid out, it's been mentioned here today, but you laid it out so that somebody that is not familiar with the topography of Ukraine can understand what we're talking about giving land and then like a super highway to Kiev. Could you run through that one more time for our audience today?
I think the best analogy, and I say this knowing that Netanyahu is also visiting the gold-plated Mar-a-Lago. The best analogy is that Western Donbass to Ukraine is like the Golan Heights for Israel. It's a total analogy. It works very well. Israel will never give back the Golan Heights, not because the wine they make there is very good. It's awful. I've had it. But because of its strategic importance to Israel that they will never give it back. Western Donbass is the same thing for Ukraine. It is with Western Donbass, the Russians have a open invitation within 48 hours or more to just show up in Kyiv in large numbers. And so giving up Western Donbass, ceding it to Russia in any way, shape, or form would be the definition of insanity and genocide. Other 2 points here. It's not just air power. I would say that the Russians have no problem shooting at you and killing Ukrainians. They have a little more of a problem, but not much, shooting at other NATO allies. They've done this. They're playing with the ADIZs of those countries. They're overflights. They're tinkering around Gutland Island, the drones that are disrupting civilian airspace as far as Brussels, is all part of this game plan. I don't think they have a problem killing a bunch of Europeans. I think they might have a problem killing some Americans. And in terms of, I'm not going to get into details of what American boots on the ground would entail or not entail, because I simply don't know. But I will say this. There's 2 things that would actually do well for a security guarantee. The first is I would send a floating LNG terminal to Odessa, a U.S. LNG terminal, build it at Odessa, set it up, it could be done in a matter of days, and I would supply it with U.S. LNG. And it's forget about this reverse flow nonsense because the Russians have pretty much damaged all the interconnectors and the pipelines. So you really want to get fuel to Ukraine. You want them to make it through the rest of this winter. You put a floating LNG terminal, US, and then dare Russia to bomb that because they bombed that Turkish carrier, that Turkish gas carrier. But I don't think that Putin wants to bomb a US LNG terminal in Odessa. And that to me is a huge security guarantee, not only from an energy perspective, but it also tells the Russians to stop futzing around with Odessa. Leave that alone. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and John and I have talked about this and we've raised it with a lot of interlocutors, is that I would go a little bit further on Russian forces. Not only should they have to withdraw from the areas that they think they're kind of occupying now, but Russian forces should similarly be, if you want to put a cap on Ukrainian forces at 800,000, then Russian forces in Kaliningrad, Russian forces in Belgorod, Russian forces anywhere near those borders should also be similarly cut back. So in other words, you cannot forward deploy forces in Kaliningrad, you cannot forward deploy forces in Belarus, anything that can be considered something that you could generate a force and go on the attack within 48 hours. And so part of the security guarantees for me, if you're negotiating this, is you put a cap on the Russian forces that are in the region writ large, not just in Ukraine, not just physically in Crimea and the other occupied territories, but in areas where they could very quickly, rapidly reinforce those forces and do something else based on an exercise, which is what they did in Georgia, which is what they did in Moldova, etc. And so that's what I would do. That would be meaningful, and then have the U.S. be part of the monitoring of that. And the Russians violate that, boom, all bets are off there. So I think there's a couple of things that I would like to see done that actually puts a cap on Russian forces in the area as well. And that's not, as far as I know, being seriously discussed other than the piece about moving Russian forces further back from some of the occupied territory.
Let me jump in to try to generalize from Debra's arguments with which I agree. No matter what the deal on the table is, no matter what the US, Ukraine, and Europe come up with, the Russians, Putin will demand more. We know this. So we might as well stop trying to come up with a deal to appease or please Putin, because there is nothing we can come up with that he will accept other than Ukraine's surrender. We need to come up with a plan that can actually provide for Ukrainian security behind stable and defensible lines, and then put the pressure on Russia to accept that deal. Stop worrying about what Putin is going to do to Ukraine and to us. Start thinking about what we can do to him and have a negotiation based on that. Look, George Kennan wrote a lot of things about Russia. Some were wise, some were less so. But one of his wise comments was that the Kremlin is impervious to the logic of reason, but highly sensitive to the logic of force, by which he didn't mean by that attack Russia or the Soviet Union. He meant negotiate from a position of strength and mean it. And if the Trump administration can finally get its head straight and stop taking Putin's bogus arguments as serious and start pushing back, then we have a much better chance of coming out ahead in this game.
Dan, I agree with you. One thing that we haven't brought up today, but you get an article every now and then and you see the evidence of what's going on that is it's in the mix, and that is the ongoing efforts to be ready for business deals in Russia when this is over. I mean, it just seems, a lot of people say it, some people deny it, but it seems like the real push of the Trump administration, or at least certainly a contemporaneous push, is to be ready to have business deals throughout Russia and indeed in Ukraine. That may be of greater interest to him than quote unquote stopping the killing. Comments about that?
Well, yeah, this is not a hard one for old old Kremlin hounds like John Herbst and me, and Debra, General Breedlove, and Hodges to figure out. Kirill Dimitrov is the good guy. He's the one who's tweeting about peace and business deals and great prosperity, whereas Dmitry Peskov and Lavrov are the bad guys growling and grimacing about terrible consequences. The Russians have been offering great business deals to gullible Americans since the 1920s. Okay, they did the same with Nixon. It doesn't work out. American businesses are going to find it no easier to do business in Russia now than they did before, and it was not very good. But it doesn't matter what the experience of businesses are. There are people in the Trump orbit who seem to be susceptible to this kind of blandishments, flattery, empty offers. There is not money to be made in this. The Russians are not going to respect foreign investment and intellectual property rights any more than the Chinese. And we've had some bad experience with that. And we should stop kidding ourselves.
To your
That
point,
said,
Bob,
tactics seem to be working. That's all right.
sorry, Dan. And to your point, Bob, if we were to sit down and decide as a group of thinkers in Washington, D.C., to advise the president, and we were going to send a team to talk to Russia about geostrategic security affairs, the team that we have now would not be in the top 50. But if we were thinking about doing business in Russia afterwards, the team that we have there now would be in the top 2 or 3. And so I think what our intent here is very much indicated by the team we've sent to try to make these negotiations.
But it's also true that were they to seek those business deals, they're going to find themselves highly likely disappointed. In the post-Soviet era, probably the two most prominent Americans doing business in Russia were Bill Browder and Michael Calvi, both running investment firms. They spoke up numerous times on behalf of business practices in Russia to bring in further Western investments. That did not protect them when they ran afoul of some Russian oligarch who had a better roof or better protection in the Kremlin than they had, and they both wound up in jail. They're out of jail now. Browder is on a Putin hit list, Calvi not so, but they both spent time in jail, and they lost a lot of their property.
Well, I'd like to say to Jared and Witkoff, you two can be pushed off a 17th floor balcony. I mean, Trump leaves, you're there doing business, and one day you're just pushed off a balcony. I mean, I don't know what people think they're going to get out of Russia business-wise. I mean, fossil fuel and fossil fuel byproducts. But I do think there's something else important here. I do think that Trump is very much like Joe Biden in one fundamental way, probably more than one. He's scared to death of Russia's nuclear weapons. And when Putin says, I can use nuclear weapons, I can do this, he actually believes it, and he's actually afraid of it. So he's one part loves Putin because he wants to be exactly like him, the sort of dictatorial inclinations. On the other side, he's really afraid of this whole nuclear weapons thing. And so I think more than any sort of obsequious behavior, this drives him, and he actually believes this. And I think he's no different than Joe Biden in that regard.
I must say, Deborah, that I've heard that from a couple of people that are close to Trump, that That is something that he worries about a great deal when he's talking about all of this. But of course, we have military people and others on this panel that we all know that they've got nuclear weapons, but the fear about what he's going to do and how he might do it doesn't seem to control the thinking of General Breedlove, General Hodges. Is that wrong? Phil?
Well, I think it would be foolish to say that anybody that has the experience of Ben Hodges or others blow off the idea of nukes. We all have to respect, to a certain degree, nukes. But this is not the first time our nation has faced this conundrum. Reagan faced it in the intermediate range nuclear crises of his time. Kennedy faced it over the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I agree, I've been lectured that they're not the same. But the fact remains, we have had U.S. leaders who've had to stand up to Russian threats. And right now, we are not functioning well in the face of Mr. Putin's threats. I believe they are very much guiding the actions of our leaders. And I just see that as a big driving factor. What is the world learning right now? All you need to have to push America around is nuclear weapons. And so I don't like what the future looks like if everybody decides they can shape U.S. policy by threatening nuclear attack. Over.
One other thing on this, to General Breedlove's point, I think it was absolutely timed perfectly to talk about the new missiles that they put into Belarus and saying that they're now up and running. That was designed to run coincident with these talks. And I think the answer to Putin on this sort of thing is, you too can be dust. I mean, there's a very simple answer to this. You really want to go down that path? You too can be dust. And that was sort of what Reagan was saying. But I think Trump's just scared to death of this stuff.
Well,
And
that would require President Trump to turn into the person that Ambassador Fried thinks he possibly could be, and that's not going to happen in our lifetime.
yeah.
Dan?
Well, there was a question in the chat that came up similar to Ben's as to whether Trump is on Ukraine's side or Russia's side. I don't think President Trump is on Ukraine's side. There are many who think he's on Putin's side, and there is some evidence for that. But I think Trump is on Trump's side. I think he sees himself as coming out ahead if he can broker a deal. I think he's indifferent to Ukraine's security, but he doesn't want to be seen to be a sucker. He wants to be vindicated. He wants to show that the critics who said he was Putin's puppet are wrong. And the only way he can do that is by getting a decent deal. Now, I'm not going to say that Ben is wrong. I can't do that. He could end up being right. Okay? I have only low to medium confidence in my own assessment here. But I think it is plausible that Trump in the end will not want to give away Ukraine, not because he believes in the free world, but because he doesn't want to be seen as a sucker. And I think that Zelensky has handled President Trump well ever since after the February 28th blow up in the Oval Office. And I think that explains why, as John Herbst put it, the package that started out as terrible with the 28 points has moved in a decent direction. And that is why Trump is trying to overturn it, because he sees this possible danger and he wants to disrupt, delay, deflect, rather than deal in an honest way. And the only way to change Putin's mind is to put pressure on him, and we've got the tools to do so.
We're coming to the end of the hour. there's a lot more to discuss, but and there's other questions in the box, but I think we better do our lightning round, and we'll do it in the same order that we did starting off. Final comments and things, and I will throw out here, maybe this is too much. This same group, the Friends of Ukraine National Security Task Force, for a number of years, our recommendations were all built on what the United States should do regarding Ukraine. And that was to establish an unequivocal policy of Ukraine winning. We've backed off of that, obviously, based on circumstances, but I guess there's no, in the current situation, I guess that is not a possibility, but it's a shame. Anyway, Phil?
Well, we haven't talked much about it, and you know that I love America and I love the American people. There's an awful lot of American people that are not really well educated on Mr. Putin and what Mr. Putin's aims are. And we have an awful lot of great Americans who follow their quote unquote political leaders. And I think that we all could do a great service to our nation by helping America understand who Mr. Putin is, what Russia is all about, and get past the politics of I follow that guy or that person or that woman or whatever, and wherever they go, I go. I really believe that Americans are not the kind of people that support a KGB agent war criminal who is running an illegal, immoral, and inhumane war. If we can just get them to really get themselves wrapped around who that is and what that is, I think it would make a difference.
Good. Deborah?
I would just say that this is one of those be careful what you wish for, Donald Trump, because I think the best thing that's come out of this so far is a rejuvenated Europe and alliances in Europe that we haven't seen since before the First World War. And I think that's significant. And I think the goose that laid the golden egg for Trump is U.S. defense industry. And if you're following the defense trades like I am, because of this lack of trust of Trump vis-a-vis Ukraine and everything else, the number of arms purchases that are being made from European producers, from Korean producers, from Israeli producers is pretty significant. And it's starting to hurt the bottom line of major U.S. defense firms because they're going elsewhere to buy their stuff because they don't trust the U.S. and they don't trust that the U.S. will let them use the weapons the way they want to. And so I said, if I wanted to see one very interesting thing coming out of this is it's this rejuvenation of Europe that is going to be holding the line. Now, are they perfect? Absolutely not. But are they moving in the right direction? Yes. And if Russia did not think this was a threat, they wouldn't be trying to assassinate the head of Rheinmetall.
Thank you. Good observation. Dan?
Well, isolationists may not be interested in war, but war is interested in them. Within the Trump administration, you can find just about every bad strategic thought that Americans have had for the past 100 years. Isolationism, Fortress North America, transactionalism, hostility to values. We learned the hard way that American interests, the true meaning of America first, is to work with our allies because our interests and our values advance together or not at all. This is a lesson we learned the hard way. And it's a lesson that we used during the Cold War to achieve an ultimate success. And I think we will get there again. John Herbst has often said that public opinion polling shows that Trump's base, the MAGA base, supports Ukraine. I think there are a lot of Americans who still support American leadership of the free world. They just want to see the Europeans step up and carry their weight. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. if we end up in a decent place at the end of whatever it is we're going through, it'll be because the Europeans are willing to step up and we're willing to let them. That kind of partnership can work. Otherwise, if we let the bad ideas of pre-Pearl Harbor America take over and stay in power, we're going to get similarly bad results.
Thank you, Dan. Ben?
So I am worried at the pace. Let's just say that what my distinguished diplomat friends have said about the negotiations and the Trump administration and what he's trying to do and how it's really eventually going to work out. How many thousands of Ukrainians have to get killed in their apartments while we're waiting for this to go on? While this president continues to fail to use the enormous leverage he has. Yes, the sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil were implemented, but no secondary sanctions on any company that buys oil from them. And India's import of oil from Russia actually went up last month. Lindsey Graham has been going around, I don't know, for 6 months bragging about, I've got 85 senators ready on this massive sanctions package. It was kind of a bullshit thing anyway. But the fact is, you've got Republican senators who know better. And he used to love to walk around with John McCain and try and be, seen as his wingman. What an absolute embarrassment of American leadership by Republicans in the Senate and in the House. When Mike Turner, who I used to think was one of the super champions of NATO and transatlantic and all that, he was asked on Jonathan Karl's show this weekend, hey, so what did you think about which side is the president on? And he goes, well, he's on the side of peace. I mean, come on. Now, you used to be the mayor of Dayton or Toledo, Ohio. You can do better than that. And I think that the easing of sanctions by the Trump administration in other areas, this is why the Russians will keep doing what they're doing, because they see that we do not have the will to use the leverage that we have. This thing could have been over in President Trump's first hour. If he would have said, if he was prepared for Russia as he was prepared to tear down U.S. State Department, he could have said this, big giant Donald Trump signature on executive order, make it happen. We'd be having a different conversation right now. I hate to be, for a person who was born and always been an optimist.
You went moot.
Yeah, I'm very skeptical. The Russians, I'm skeptical of his willingness to do what he could do. And I agree with Dan on that.
John.
Okay. I think just about everything has been said. I agree with Ben's points that our policy could have moved quickly in the right direction and things would be far better than they are today. That's been true since actually the big invasion, since the war started in 2014. I also agree that the American people overwhelmingly support a stronger policy against Russia, helping Ukraine. 69% in the poll that came out a few months ago said they'd want to see as much as or more aid to Ukraine as was given under President Biden. Sadly, we're not doing that either. But at the end of the day, we've been dealing with not quite resolute leadership in the West in general, including in Washington, since the war began in 2014 and since the big invasion. We've seen significant improvement in European leadership as a result of the questions that Trump has raised about potential American support for Ukraine, questions which I regret. I don't think they serve American interests, but they've nonetheless spurred the Europeans to do more. And as long as Western support remains solid, not wonderful, but solid, including the American component, Putin will not win this war. Ukraine will emerge sovereign, secure, and ultimately prosperous. But that is still not a guarantee, and that's why we're on this podcast, and we'll be doing this for months ahead. Bob, thank you for organizing this. and a good
Well, and
conversation.
thank all of,
Great
not only for
colleagues.
this, but thank all of you for being part of the Friends of Ukraine network, along with all the others that are on that, and the work that you do in your individual capacities. I mean, we're all pushing for a better world and for Ukraine in this whole thing. And I thank you very much. Have a great new year, and let's hope it's better for Ukraine.